It might have been better if he'd been a little bit more diplomatic and sort of said, hey guys, you know, I'd love her to be, I really love her and I just want to be near her.
Nobody ever thought Paul McCartney could hold a grudge, but oh, he's holding one now. The man who gave the world Yesterday, who once sang about love and peace, has finally hit his breaking point. At 82, that calm Beatle charm has cracked wide open, and Paul's ready to drop names and throw shade. He's calling out 6 bands that dissed him, copied him, and tried to steal his shine. One group even claimed they were bigger than the Beatles. Can you imagine? Once you hear who's on his list, you'll never see Paul McCartney the same way again. And here's the wild twist. The first name on Paul's Never Again list is none other than the Rolling Stones. For years, everyone thought it was just friendly competition between rock legends, but Paul, he saw it as straight-up sabotage. He felt like the Stones weren't inspired, they were copying. According to Paul, they lifted everything, the sound, the clothes, the whole energy. He didn't see rivals, he saw imitators. Back in the late 60s, Paul was locked in the studio for endless nights, crafting Revolver, building new sounds with reversed guitars and dreamy harmonies. Then, just a few months later, boom, the Stones dropped Aftermath, suddenly experimenting with sitars, echo, and psychedelic vibes that looked a little too familiar. Paul was furious. He told his friends the Stones were always copying us, never leading. You can almost picture him pacing around Abbey Road, fuming over every riff. Then came the moment that broke his patience completely. After the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an album that flipped the entire music world upside down, the Stones came out swinging with their Satanic Majesty's request. From the psychedelic cover to the costumes and even the lyrics, it all looked like a discount version of Pepper. Paul allegedly slammed the record down at Abbey Road and yelled, "They even stole the bloody cover!" Imagine being there for that outburst. And get this, it never really cooled off. Decades later, in 2021, Paul reignited the fire when he told The New Yorker, "The Stones are a blues cover band." Our net was cast a bit wider. That one line blew up the entire industry. Mick Jagger laughed it off on stage, saying, "Paul's adorable, but we're still out here playing stadiums." But insiders knew there was tension simmering under those smiles. Studio folks have whispered that Paul refuses to even say the Stones during sessions. He'll mention Elvis, Dylan, even Lennon, but when it comes to Mick and Keith, he clams up completely. That silence speaks louder than any quote ever could. But wait, it gets even messier. The next name on Paul's blacklist? The Sex Pistols. And this one wasn't about sound, it was straight-up disrespect. These punks didn't just reject the Beatles, they mocked them to their faces. The drama went down in early 1977 inside London's AIR studios. Paul was there with Wings, laying down tracks, when he crossed paths with the Pistols in the hallway. Ever the gentleman, Paul smiled and said, "Hello, Sid." But Sid Vicious stared him dead in the eye and sneered, "You're just another establishment sellout." Can you believe that? Paul froze. Nobody, not even John Lennon, had ever come at him like that. Without a single word, he turned and walked away, face cold as stone. From that day on, Paul pretended the Sex Pistols didn't exist. To Paul, punk wasn't rebellion, it was straight-up chaos in leather jackets. He saw the Sex Pistols not as musicians, but as noise merchants gone wild. He once called their sound an assault on the ears and couldn't believe kids were worshiping a band that could barely handle 3 chords. But the Pistols, they didn't flinch. Johnny Rotten fired back, calling Paul a fossil in a velvet suit, mocking everything McCartney stood for. They clowned the Beatles' soft melodies, saying it was music for your grandma. Brutal words that cut deep. What really burned Paul wasn't just the insults, it was how the media loved the drama. Every time the Pistols took a jab, headlines went crazy. Instead of standing up for Paul, the press called it the punk revolution. Imagine being the man who wrote Hey Jude and watching chaos get crowned as the future of music. Paul later tried to play it cool, saying, "It wasn't my thing, but maybe it cleared the air." But come on, everyone knew that smile was hiding some serious rage. Being mocked right in his own studio wasn't something he could just shrug off. That hit different. It stung his pride and left a mark he never forgot. And then came the next name on Paul's "You've got to be kidding me" list. Oasis, those loud, swaggering brothers from Manchester who stomped onto the scene calling themselves the New Beatles. For Paul, that wasn't flattery, it was blasphemy. Back in the Britpop boom of the mid-90s, Noel and Liam Gallagher were everywhere, strutting around like they'd been born at Abbey Road. They rocked the mop-top haircuts, posed for throwback photos, and even dropped album covers that looked suspiciously Beatles-inspired. Noel once bragged, "If it weren't for the Beatles, there'd be no Oasis." Sounds respectful, right? Not to Paul. It only made things worse. To him, they weren't paying tribute. They were biting his legacy with a smirk. Behind closed doors, Paul didn't mince words. He reportedly called their music loud and self-important, like a group playing dress-up with history. Then came the final straw. In 1996, Noel Gallagher boldly told MTV, "We are bigger than the Beatles." That was it. Paul was done. He just laughed, shook his head, and told a friend, "They copied the chords, not the soul." What a comeback line. You could almost hear the frustration behind that calm tone. From that point on, Paul refused to take them seriously. It wasn't about jealousy, it was about attitude. Oasis walked around like they owned the very legacy they borrowed from. When Liam Gallagher strutted across the Glastonbury stage wearing Lennon-style glasses, Paul watched from home and muttered, "Even the glasses." Later, in an interview, he quipped, "They remind me of us, except we could actually play." That joke hit like a mic drop. Over the years, Noel tried to make peace, even calling Paul a hero, but that ship had already sailed. Paul never collaborated with them, never joined any Beatles tributes they touched, and never entertained that comparison again. He summed it all up perfectly when he said, "You can't inherit greatness. You've got to bleed for it." That one sentence showed exactly how he felt about Oasis. No shortcuts to legend status. And then, the next name on Paul's not-so-secret blacklist, the Monkees. The so-called plastic band he just couldn't forgive. Ever wonder who Paul once labeled as plastic musicians? Yeah, that title went straight to the Monkees. To Paul, they weren't real artists. They were actors pretending to be rock stars, a made-for-TV project built to cash in on Beatlemania. That idea drove him crazy. Whenever "I'm a Believer" came on the radio, Paul would instantly switch the station, grumbling, "They're singing our style without earning it." To him, the Monkees represented everything fake about fame. Manufactured music, pre-written songs, and image over soul. In his eyes, they were proof that the industry had learned how to fake the Beatles' magic, but never their heart. What really pushed Paul over the edge came in 1967, right after Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band flipped the entire music scene on its head. Suddenly, the Monkees went full psychedelic, wild colors, trippy lyrics, and dreamy visuals that screamed, "Beatles knockoff." To Paul, that wasn't inspiration, it was straight-up robbery. George Harrison once told close friends that Paul was pacing around the studio, furious, shouting, "They're stealing our bloody blueprint." That was the moment Paul stopped brushing them off as goofy imitators and started seeing them as full-blown frauds. Things got tense fast. At a Hollywood party that same year, Mickey Dolenz from the Monkees tried to chat with Paul, hoping to break the ice. But Paul just looked him in the eye, gave a half-smile, and walked away mid-sentence. Dolenz later admitted, "I don't think he ever saw us as musicians." Ouch. That's a cold burn from one of the most respected men in rock. And the grudge? It never faded. Even decades later, when Paul was asked in 2011 about the Monkees, he gave that signature smirk, the kind that said everything without saying a single word. Catchy tunes, but certainly no Beatles. That's all Paul said, smiling politely. But the tone underneath was sharp enough to cut glass. And just when you think that was the end of it, another name popped up on Paul's silent grudge list, the Bee Gees. And this one wasn't about competition, it was personal. Paul didn't just dislike their sound, he couldn't stand what they represented. To Paul, the Bee Gees were a neon sign flashing the end of his golden age. By the late 70s, disco ruled the planet. Saturday Night Fever was everywhere. Movie theaters, radios, record stores. You couldn't escape it. The Gibb brothers' smooth falsettos were dominating the same airwaves that once belonged to the Beatles, and Paul wasn't having it. He once told his Wings guitarist, Lawrence Juber, "It's the same 3 chords as everyone else, just faster." It sounded playful, but everyone in the room could tell that joke carried a sting of envy. The Bee Gees were smashing records the Beatles once owned, and that burned deep. By 1979, things hit a boiling point when both Paul and the Bee Gees were recording in Miami. Word around the studio was that Paul actually changed his recording schedule just to avoid bumping into them. An engineer who witnessed it said, "You could feel the tension. The Bee Gees were celebrating another hit, and Paul just stared at the floor." Picture that. Paul McCartney, the man who defined pop stardom, standing silent while a new sound took over the throne. What made it even tougher? The Bee Gees never dissed him, not once. They always spoke respectfully about the Beatles. But Paul's silence said it all. For someone who built pop perfection from scratch, watching Disco Fever outshine Beatlemania must have hit him right in the heart. The music world had moved on, and Paul couldn't hide how much that hurt. And then came the last name on Paul's not-so-secret grudge list: the Beach Boys. Now this one wasn't all hate. It was more like admiration that curdled into obsession. Back in 1966, when Pet Sounds dropped, Paul was in total awe. He called God Only Knows the most beautiful song ever written, and he meant it. He praised the album everywhere he went, on TV, in interviews, even to his bandmates. But as time passed, that admiration turned into something more complicated, almost an obsession. Paul once told producer George Martin, "We've got to top this." That single line didn't just spark motivation, it lit a creative explosion that became Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And it worked. The album changed everything: music, culture, the whole scene. But deep down, Paul knew Pet Sounds had been the real match that set the fire. That quiet envy never left him. Even decades later, when fans compared Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper, Paul would smile humbly. But those close to him swore his eyes told a different story. That spark of competition never burned out. He never forgot who pushed him to chase perfection in the first place. Then came Smile, Brian Wilson's mysterious, mind-bending project that had the entire music world buzzing. It was hyped as the album of all albums, the one to change music forever. And Paul? He was watching every move, fascinated. He even dropped by one of Brian's sessions, playfully using a carrot as a percussion gag just to be part of the chaos. But when Brian eventually scrapped Smile after his mental breakdown, Paul's sympathy didn't last long. People close to him said Paul shrugged and muttered, "If you can't finish what you start, you shouldn't be in this business." Harsh words, but classic McCartney bluntness. The real explosion came later that same year at a high-end dinner in Los Angeles. Paul, riding high from Sgt. Pepper's success, reportedly made a sharp remark about the Beach Boys' new tracks, calling them a bit simplistic. Oof. That hit Brian Wilson hard, so hard that friends said he went completely silent for days after. That one comment shifted everything. Interviews that once dripped with mutual praise suddenly went cold. Brian stopped mentioning Paul altogether, and their creative friendship, two geniuses who once inspired each other, just quietly vanished from the spotlight. Years rolled on, but Paul's quiet grudges didn't fade. They aged with him. The same man who once sang about peace, love, and unity carried invisible scars from decades of competition and creative battles. Even now, in his 80s, while most stars mellow out, Paul's memory for betrayal stays razor sharp. Those close to him say he still dodges certain names in conversation. He stays polite, sure, but that sly McCartney smirk always gives him away. Behind closed doors, Paul has admitted that fame isn't what people think it is. "People remember the cheers," he once said, "but not the competition behind the curtain." That one quote says everything. Every musician who got too close to his legacy became a quiet threat in his eyes. He respected talent, but only when it didn't try to step on his shadow. Look at how he deals with modern pop acts. When artists like Coldplay or Ed Sheeran called him the greatest, Paul smiled for the cameras, waved for the fans, but insiders say he found that praise a little hollow. He'd joke, "They all say they're inspired by us, but none of them push it far enough." It wasn't anger, it was frustration. Paul didn't want copycats, he wanted evolution. He wanted to see someone earn greatness, not borrow it. And don't think the new rock bands got off easy either. In an interview from the 2000s, Paul dropped a line that made the industry flinch. "Most of these new groups are just building castles out of old sand." It sounded playful, but everyone knew he meant business. That jab echoed through the music world, because deep down, Paul still measures everyone against one impossible standard: the Beatles. The biggest twist of all came when those old rivalries started bubbling back up. In 2023, word spread that Mick Jagger had reached out, inviting Paul to join the Rolling Stones for a surprise collaboration. On paper, it sounded legendary. Two titans of rock history sharing one stage, but Paul didn't even hesitate. He turned it down flat. Insiders say he quietly muttered, "I've already done my bit for history." Translation? He wasn't about to jam with the same guys he once accused of stealing his entire sound. After more than half a century, it's wild to think those old Beatles versus Stones wounds still hadn't healed. But here's what's real. Behind all the pride, the envy, and those unspoken grudges, Paul's passion for music never died. Every rivalry, every insult, every dig thrown his way only pushed him harder. While others faded into nostalgia, Paul stayed unstoppable, still writing, still touring, still chasing that same magic he once bottled up in Abbey Road. That fire, it never went out. And maybe that's the truth nobody really talks about. Paul's grudges weren't just about hurt feelings. They were about purpose. Every wannabe Beatles act, every band that tried to copy his magic, reminded him of the one thing he feared most: being replaced. Because deep down, the man who wrote Yesterday wasn't scared of competition. He was scared of being forgotten. Through decades of rivalries, sly jabs, and headline-making feuds, one thing's clear: Paul McCartney might be a legend, but he's also human. For all the peace signs, the gentle ballads, and that charming smile, there's a fighter behind the curtain, a man who spent a lifetime guarding the legacy of the Beatles. And honestly, who could blame him? When you've helped create the most iconic band in history, everyone who comes after you automatically feels like a challenge. Even now, in his 80s, Paul's energy leaves people speechless. He's still filling arenas, still penning new hits, still rocking that bass like time can't touch him. But what fans don't always see is the quiet reflection behind closed doors. To close friends, he's confessed that fame never really leaves. It just changes form. "You don't stop being compared," he once said. "You just stop caring who's comparing." But deep down, those comparisons still cut a little. What's crazy is how those bitter rivalries from the past have slowly turned into something resembling respect. Paul might never forgive certain bands for copying his rhythm or mocking his art, but he's learned to play the long game. He knows time is the real judge of legends, and time has spoken. When fans list the greatest songs ever written, Hey Jude, Let It Be, and Yesterday still stand tall. No disco groove, punk chaos, or Britpop swagger ever managed to replace the emotional punch of those timeless tracks. Paul knows it, and that's why he never really lost, even when he acted like he didn't care about winning. Still, that unshakable drive, it's what keeps him alive. The challenge, the competition, the hunger to outdo even his own legacy, it's all part of what makes him Paul McCartney. It's like he's been in a lifelong race against his own shadow, determined to prove that no one, not even history, can outshine what he built. The Beatles may have broken up more than 50 years ago, but for Paul, the game never truly ended. Every new artist, every tribute band, every chart-topping hit, he sees them all as part of the same marathon he started back in Liverpool. The world may call him a legend, but Paul McCartney still sees himself as the guy chasing perfection, still proving, decade after decade, that he's not just part of music history. He is music history. And maybe that's the real secret behind Paul McCartney's fire: the grudges, the envy, the pride that never fades. All that emotion, all that quiet competition, it fuels his art. Without that spark, maybe we wouldn't have decades of unforgettable hits that still echo through time. Because let's be real, Paul's story isn't just about peace and love. It's about ambition, obsession, and the unstoppable drive to stay at the top. That mix of genius and stubbornness, that's what turned him from a pop star into a living legend. So, what do you think? Was Paul right to hold on to those grudges, or should he have let the past slide? Do you see it as pride or protection of his legacy? Drop your thoughts down below in the comments. I seriously want to know what side you're on. Let's get that debate going. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the wild, untold rivalries of rock's biggest icons, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. There's way more drama, secrets, and stories from the legends you thought you knew. And trust me, it only gets crazier from here. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned, because the next video might just expose another secret from behind the curtain of music history. See you in the next video.